Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to the 502 building here at the University of Liverpool. My name is Jerry Diver, and it's great to see you all here today for our annual Seamus Heaney lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the first person you're going to hear from this evening. It's our Dean from the School of History, Languages and Culture, Alison Fell, Professor Alison Fell. Thank you. Alison.
Thanks, Jerry. It's wonderful to see such a full house this evening, and I know we are in for a wonderful evening. So thank you, first of all, for coming. I want to wish you a very warm welcome on this chilly evening. The Institute of Irish Studies in the School of Histories, Languages and Cultures that I'm Dean of is a very unique part of the University of Liverpool, and we're very proud of it. And one of the reasons that it's quite unique is because it's very outward-facing and engaged in the world, partly because it has a Blair Chair funded by the Irish government. Professor Pete Shirlow can't make it here this evening, but he is our Blair Chair. Partly, I think, because of that relationship, we have a very supportive and close relationship with the Irish Consul General and Vice Consul General for the North of England, who I think are here this evening, who are very supportive. It's also got a very close relationship with the city of Liverpool, for example, with the Irish Festival. And this year, as part of the activities that the Institute has run and organised, there have been some really wonderful events that have attracted over 10,000 people. So that included the Beckett Festival, Beckett Confined, which was a series of performances of Beckett plays that were less well known in quite unusual venues. So we were plunged into darkness in Toxteth Reservoir before we saw the Beckett play, which was one of my most memorable experiences this year. There's also a wonderful exhibition at the moment at the Victoria Gallery and Museum that runs till the 23rd of December by Fionn Gunn, who is an Irish diaspora artist who has themes of travel and belonging, which is so pertinent for obviously a city of Liverpool in which Irish people and Irish identities are woven into the fabric of this wonderful city. But the annual Seamus Heaney lecture is really one of the jewels in the crown of the Institute. We're so grateful and privileged to host it every year and to have such a series of distinguished speakers, including the speakers we have this evening. And I'd like to thank the Heaney family as well for their support and who are also here this evening with us. So the Institute of Irish Studies is a place where people come together, both within and outside of the university. It's a place in which we believe that research about the island of Ireland's complex histories and cultures needs to take those different perspectives, take a long and a shorter view. One of the key themes is social justice, human rights and conflict transformation, which I think are pertinent themes for tonight's lecture. So thanks once again, and now I'm going to introduce Professor Frank Shovelin, who himself will introduce our speakers.
Thanks very much, Alison, and you're all very welcome to this evening's Heaney lecture. Justine is going to be reading some poetry this evening, both before and after the lecture and within the lecture, to remind us of the legacy of Seamus Heaney. Justine Mitchell was born in Dublin. She's an actor who has worked extensively in the UK and Ireland. Most recent credits include Beginning at the National Theatre and West End, Derry Girls on Channel 4, Smother for RTE, and Conversations with Friends for the BBC. Please welcome Justine Mitchell.
From The Republic of Conscience by Seamus Heaney. 1. When I landed in the Republic of Conscience, it was so noiseless when the engine stopped. I could hear a curlew high above the runway. At immigration, the clerk was an old man who produced a wallet from his homespun coat and showed me a photograph of my grandfather. The woman in customs asked me to declare the words of our traditional cures and charms to heal dumbness and avert the evil eye. No porters, no interpreter, no taxi. You carried your own burden, and very soon your symptoms of creeping privilege disappeared. 2. Fog is a dreaded omen there, but lightning spells universal good, and parents hang swaddled infants in trees during thunderstorms. Salt is their precious mineral, and seashells are held to the ear during births and funerals. The base of all inks and pigments is seawater. Their sacred symbol is a stylized boat. The sail is an ear, the mast a sloping pen, the hull a mouth shape, the keel an open eye. At their inauguration, public leaders must swear to uphold unwritten law and weep to atone for their presumption to hold office, and to affirm their faith that all life sprang from salt in tears, which the sky god wept after he dreamt his solitude was endless. 3. I came back from the frugal republic with 2 arms, the one length, the customs woman having insisted my allowance was myself. The old man rose and gazed into my face and said that was official recognition, that I was now a dual citizen. He therefore desired me, when I got home, to consider myself a representative and to speak on their behalf in my own tongue. Their embassies, he said, were everywhere, but operated independently, and no ambassador would ever be relieved.
Thank you, Justine. Our lecture this evening will be delivered by Philippe Sands. Philippe Sands, KC, is Professor of Public Understanding of Law at University College London, and Samuel and Judith Pisar, Visiting Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. He is a practicing barrister at 11 KBW Chambers and appears as counsel before the International Court of Justice and other international courts and tribunals. He sits as an arbitrator in international investment disputes and the Court of Arbitration for Sport. He is author of Lawless World, 2005, Torture Team, 2008, and numerous academic books on international law. He has contributed to the New York Review of Books, Vanity Fair, the Financial Times, The Guardian, and the New York Times. His most recent books are East-West Street, on the Origins of Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide, 2016, which was awarded the 2016 Baillie Gifford Prize, the 2017 British Book Awards Non-Fiction Book of the Year, and the 2018 Prix Montaigne. And The Rat Line, Love, Lies and Justice on the Trail of a Nazi Fugitive, 2020, also available as BBC and France Culture podcasts. His latest book is The Last Colony, A Tale of Exile, Justice, and Britain's Colonial Legacy, 2022. Philippe is president of English Pen and a member of the board of the Hay Festival of Arts and Literature. Please welcome Philippe Sands for our 4th annual Seamus Heaney lecture on the subject of The Last Colony.
Thank you so very much for the introduction and for the welcome. It's incredibly nice to be back in the city of Liverpool, a place I've come to know a little, but not enough. It's also truly an honour and a privilege to be asked to deliver this lecture in honour of Seamus Heaney, and to do so in the presence of members of his family And I join in the thanks of everyone who made this lecture possible, including Jerry Diver and Mia Swart. I'm incredibly pleased to be here. Seamus Heaney, of course, had a certain interest in a subject that I'm interested in, which is decolonisation. I think, but I stand to be corrected, Seamus only visited Africa on one occasion, in 2002. And he did so to visit a friend of his and a friend of his family's, Kada Asmal, who I also knew pretty well because he was an international lawyer who left a fantastic legacy. And when he delivered the lecture that he gave on that occasion, he evoked poetry as a means to reinforce the demand for equality and democracy in Africa. And that is very much the theme that I am addressing today. It may be that the invitation was prompted in part by my work on the individual and the group, on crimes against humanity and genocide, a series of academic writings, litigation, books, and podcasts from East-West Street to the Rat Line, centering in part around the legacy of Nuremberg, that revolutionary moment when, for the first time in human history, a country's leaders were held to account before an international court, and the idea that no country and no person is above the law. That moment heralded a new approach to international relations and international rules. And matters of justice are very much at the heart of all my books. Another one is on its way, the third, if you like, in the trilogy this time, and I'll say it a bit more later, with a Chilean flavour. And it's always about how the personal is melded with the political and the vital role that is played by individuals. But this evening I'm going to focus on another story. It too is about responsibility and silence, memory and identity. But it lies much closer to home, in a sense, than my other books, although few people in this country seem to know anything about it. Because it seems that in this country, the United Kingdom, we're rather easily distracted by the horrors that are perpetrated by others, and we find it less comfortable or easy to engage with our own past, our colonizing instinct, and our propensity to treat the other somehow as a lesser person. This tale I'm going to talk about tonight is about a place called Chagos. It is an archipelago scattered across a vast swathe of the Indian Ocean. One of those places to which you go, as Seamus Heaney might have put it, a journey into the wideness of the world beyond. This really is the world beyond. And to be very clear at the outset, I am not independent in relation to the story that I'm telling, because for 12 and a half years I have served as counsel for Mauritius, a small African country in a case about a place that London liked to call the British Indian Ocean Territory. The British government's own website jauntily describes Chagos as an archipelago of 58 islands covering some 640,000 square kilometres of ocean, a British ocean territory administered from London, located approximately halfway between East Africa and Indonesia. Access to Chagos today, the website tells you, is restricted unless you are part of the US military or the wealthy owner of a private yacht, in which case you are directed to apply for mooring permits. But the official website says nothing, passes in silence on the past in relation to Chagos. The fact that it was the last colony ever created by Britain, and that it is today Britain's very last colony in Africa, and that it is today being illegally occupied by the United Kingdom, and that many years ago its former residents were forcibly deported, and they wish to return still today. Britain hangs on. issuing colourful, beautiful stamps, most recently of the royal angelfish under a portrait of Her Majesty the Queen. But to tell this story, I don't want to start at the beginning. I want to start near the end. And I want to start with a moment that was very powerful and special for me. It is a first-hand account of what passed. It is a short video, the witness testimony of a resident of the Chagos archipelago that was delivered in the International Court of Justice in the Great Hall in September 2018. What you're about to see is the video in its complete form. It is very short.
Je m'appelle Liseby Elysé. Je suis né le 24 juillet 1953 dans Perros-Banús. Mon papa né dans ces îles. Mon maman né dans Perros-Banús. Mon grande famille aussi est née là-bas. Je fais partie de la délégation mauricienne. Je peux raconter toutes mes souffrances depuis que je me déraciné aux îles Paradis. Nous sommes contents que la Cour internationale peut accueillir nous aujourd'hui. Et nous sommes confiants que nous pourrons retourner dans nos îles, que tout le monde prend naissance. Dans Chagos, tout le monde a son travail, a sa famille, a sa culture. Mais nous mangeons tout ce qui est frais. Bateau qui est sorti depuis Maurice, tu amènes tous nos bonnes marchandises. Nous gagnons nos rations, nous gagnons tout ce qui nous est nécessaire. Nous pas manquons rien. Dans Chagos, tout le monde vit une bonne la vie. Mais un jour, l'administrateur qui finit dire nous, qui nous peut bien quitter nos îles, quitte tout nous la case, nous aller. Tout le monde pas peu content, je suis en colère, qui fait il dit nous bien aller. Mais nous pas à soi, pas nous laisse nous connaître qui faire. Jusqu'à aujourd'hui nous pas connaître qui faire nous peut bien aller. Mais après bateau qui tu peux amener manger, fin arrête venir. Non, rien nous pas pour manger. Aucune médecine, aucun rien. Nous passons bien misère. Mais après un bateau qui vient, appelle notre verre. L'administrateur qui dit à nous, qui nous besoin embarquer, qui tous nos bagages, qui tout ça qui nous est là. Pour 10 nous laisse nous aller. Et ça, ben du monde qui bien en colère qui fait ça. Et quand fait ça dans le noir. Nous embarquer dans le noir pour nous pas trouver nos îles. Et quand nous finissons embarquer dans ce bateau là, avec mauvaises conditions. Nous avons un ban d'animaux, un ban d'esclaves de ce bateau là. Ban du monde qui type mort à la chagrin de ce bateau là. Et moi, à l'époque là, je suis enceinte 4 mois. Le bateau là prend 4 jours pour y arriver Maurice. Mais quand il est arrivé, moi, mes enfants finissent et ils finissent morts. Je dis à qui faire mes enfants finissent morts parce qu'ils m'ont trop traumatisé de ce bateau-là. Il y a beaucoup de tracas, m'ont bouleversé. À cause de ça, même quand mes enfants finissent, ils sont morts. Moi, je dis, nous ne devons pas perdre l'espoir. Nous devons imaginer qu'un jour, nous pourrons tourner dans la terre que nous sommes. Je a peu souffert et je a encore attaché avec nos îles. Que de mener. Mais personne qui n'est pas content, qui est dans cette île que je suis pour déraciner comme un ban d'animaux. Et ça fait aller qui a fait mal. Et moi, je dis, la justice bizarre faire. Et mon bizarre retourne dans mes îles. Que de mener. Est-ce qu'il y a quoi? Pas faire les qui a fait mal. Quand on dit qu'on déracine les îles, comme un animaux, pas connaître que de permet nous. Et moi bien chagrin jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Moi pas connaître même comment on sorti dans mon Chagos. Il fait à nous sortir par force. Et moi bien chagrin. Et moi l'âme collée tous les jours, moi m'imaginer qui moi bizarre retourne dans mon île. Moi dis à moi bizarre retourne dans mon île que de mener. Et moi bizarre almo là-bas. Et que nos grands-parents finissent enterrés dans l'endroit que nous prenons naissance et dans nos îles natales.
Liseby Elysé speaks in Creole, and the video was prepared because she cannot read and she cannot write. It was an extraordinary piece of testimony in that international court. I met her several years ago, and we've stayed in very close touch. Her story resonated. It reminded me of other deportations. It reminded me of the deportations of two ladies I didn't know, my great-grandmothers, of whom I wrote in East West Street, who were transported from Vienna in July 1942. And like them, Madame Elysé was allowed to take just one suitcase. After the hearing at the end of that week when we were in The Hague, she asked me a question. Why did it take so long to get to The Hague? Justice is a long game, I said to her. The origins of Liseby Elysé's story go back to years before her birth. August the 9th, 1941, a Saturday. The USS Augusta is moored in Little Placentia Sound off the coast of Newfoundland, another British colony. On board, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill are quarrelling about the future of the British Empire. The President tells the Prime Minister that both countries must work together to end a backward colonial policy and support an idea that will come to be known as the right of self-determination. Words matter. The two men signed a document they called the Atlantic Charter, their hopes for a better future for the world. Churchill didn't realize that he had walked into a trap. The document committed the two countries to respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live. It reflected Roosevelt's hope that the colonized would soon obtain their own nation-states. Churchill read the document rather differently. He would tell, a few days later, the House of Commons that the words in the Atlantic Charter were only for those who lived under the Nazi yoke. They were not for the British colonies. But that reading wasn't shared in Africa, where a young man called Nelson Mandela recognized the significance of what had happened. He took a clipping of the newspaper and kept it in his breast pocket for years. It heralded, in his view, as he described in his autobiography, a new era of full and equal citizenship, of an end to discrimination. One thing led to another. The idea in the Atlantic Charter influenced the drafting of the United Nations Charter in the summer of 1949. Decolonization was the hottest subject around, wrote Ralph Bunche, the lead American negotiator on colonial issues, as decolonization became an aim of the UN Charter. 5 years later, Ralph Bunche would become the first black man to win the Nobel Prize for Peace. Article 1 of the Charter committed countries to the principle of self-determination of peoples. The language was revolutionary. The term wasn't defined, and that was a compromise for the British and the French, who didn't really like it. So began the process known as decolonization. For Britain, it started with India and much bloodshed, and then it went on and on and on and on. Nevertheless, large parts of Africa remained under colonial rule, as Britain and France held on to distant possessions and subjects. In Mauritius, the British governor, Hilary Rudolph Robert Blood, remained happily ensconced in what he called his pocket handkerchief paradise. Then, in 1960, in Cape Town, Harold Macmillan evoked a wind of change as 16 African countries joined the United Nations in a single year. As he did so, a British diplomat at the United Nations complained that decolonization was based on emotion rather than reason, that it was, in his words, a form of color prejudice in reverse. It reflected, in the views of this diplomat, an unjustified resentment of darker peoples against the past domination of the world by European nations. In the autumn of 1960, self-determination reached the United Nations General Assembly. On December the 14th of that year, 89 countries voted in favour of Resolution 1514. Not one voted against. Britain was one of the 9 countries to abstain. didn't like the idea of self-determination as a legal right. The resolution declared that all peoples have the right to self-determination and prohibited, in terms, explicitly, the partial or total disruption of the territorial integrity of any colony. Frederick Boland, an Irish diplomat, presided over the adoption of that resolution in the General Assembly. He welcomed its adoption because he had personal experience of British colonial largesse. The Assembly may well congratulate itself on its accomplishment, he declared, and brought down the gavel. His daughter, who accompanied him in New York, would become a renowned poet.
This poem is called Witness by Eavan Boland. Here is the city, its worn-down mountains, its grass and iron, its smoky coast seen from the high roads on the Wicklow side, from Dorky Island to the North Wall, to the blue distance seizing its perimeter. Its old divisions are deep within it. And in me also, and always will be. Out of my mouth they come, the spurred and booted garrisons, the men and women they dispossessed. What is a colony if not the brutal truth that when we speak, the graves open and the dead walk?
What is a colony, if not the brutal truth that when we speak, the graves open and the dead walk? As the right of self-determination came into existence, the people of Mauritius urged Britain to give them their independence. At the same time, the United States was developing a new policy, one to place military bases on distant atolls around the world. A word about Mauritius. The Treaty of Paris, signed in May 1814, ended the Napoleonic Wars, prohibited international trade in enslaved people, and ceded various French colonies to Britain. One of those colonies was called Île-de-France, otherwise known as Mauritius. It came with dependencies, including the Chagos archipelago, about 2,000 kilometers away, closer to the Maldives, in fact, 58 islands and atolls, and a vast oceanic space. The islands included Diego Garcia, and far to the north, Perros Banhos, 2 islands with copra oil-producing plantations. By the early 1960s, as self-determination was written into international law, Chagos had about 2,000 inhabitants. Most of them worked for the Société Huilière de Diego y Perros. They were mostly descendants of the original enslaved inhabitants, black people who came mostly from Mozambique. Britain resisted recognizing the independence of Mauritius because it wanted something in return. Secretly, it acceded to an American request to make the island of Diego Garcia available to it for a 70-year lease as a communications facility. The British decided they would empty the whole of the Chagos archipelago, remove every single inhabitant. We can do this, a Whitehall memorandum concluded, but we must be careful to avoid the charge that we are trafficking in colonies or disregarding the interests of the inhabitants, or, worse still, creating a new colony. Ever inventive, civil servants and lawyers in London sought to circumvent international law and Resolution 1514. We can detach Chagos from Mauritius either by securing the consent of Mauritius or simply presenting them with a fait accompli. It must be done, however, as rapidly as possible. The Prime Minister, who will be known to many of you around these constituencies, Harold Wilson, declared. A local MP, of course, here. That statement was made in private. The Mauritians opposed the detachment of a part of their territory. They were invited to London to discuss independence. On the 23rd of September 1965, Mr. Wilson met the Mauritian leader at 10 Downing Street, Mr. Ramgoolam. A briefing paper instructed Mr. Wilson how to deal with Mr. Ramgoolam. The object, he was told, is to frighten Ramgoolam with hope. Hope that he might get independence, fright lest he might not unless he's sensible about the detachment of the Chagos archipelago. Diego Garcia can be detached unilaterally by order in council or with your agreement, Mr. Wilson told Mr. Ramgoolam. Under this intense pressure, an understanding was reached. In return for the detachment of Chagos, Mauritius would finally get its independence. A little compensation, a few trade concessions, and the odd fishing rights around Chagos. And the British assured if the need for facilities ever disappeared, the islands would be returned to Mauritius. And so on the 24th of September 1965, Britain announced independence for Mauritius. Behind the scenes, the Colonial Secretary, Mr. Anthony Greenwood, prepared the way forward. Present the UN with a fait accompli, bypass Parliament, adopt an order in council, detach Chagos, create a separate colony, and do it now. There was, however, one real problem, a very human problem. What should we do with the inhabitants? And so the British and the Americans agreed to proceed on the basis of an outright lie. They would tell the United Nations that Chagos did not have a permanent population, that all of the Chagosians, whether they were aged 20, like Liseby Elysé, or 4, like her nephew Olivier Bancu, were merely contract labourers. The object of the exercise is to get some rocks which will remain ours, a Foreign Office official declared, so that Chagos becomes, these are his words, and I apologise for them, a place with no indigenous population except seagulls, a place in which the Tarzans or Men Fridays would disappear. The Privy Council made an order in council, created the new British Indian Ocean Territory, all of Chagos, which was then removed from the Mauritian constitution. A new Biot commissioner was given the power to remove the entire population. In New York, the act prompted an instant reaction. The General Assembly expressed deep concern, instructing Britain not to violate Mauritius's territorial integrity and not dismember Chagos. Britain ignored the resolution and all future resolutions, declaring that the disruption of the territorial integrity of Mauritius was a clear and manifest violation of international law. Instead, the British gave the Americans a 70-year lease and decided they would never charge a penny. It was a very generous British gift. And so, in March 1968, Mauritius became independent, and 1 month later, it joined the United Nations. The Americans moved into Diego Garcia immediately. They constructed an airport. In Christmas 1972, the comedian Mr. Bob Hope visited for Christmas, accompanied by a troupe of 75 performers, including 32 American beauties, as he called them, and Miss Australia, who had recently been crowned Miss World. By then, the entire population of Diego Garcia had been forcibly removed at gunpoint by British soldiers.
We started out early Christmas morning to pay a visit to 1,200 sea bees stuck in the middle of the Indian Ocean on a fly speck called Diego Garcia. This 2,200-mile detour was a command performance, our answer to a lot of requests of the sea bees and their relatives. Finding it was only a minor triumph. We were the first jet to attempt to land there. The Seabees had worked feverishly the last 2 weeks to make this possible. Then we were greeted by a torrential tropical wind and rain. These Seabees were determined to have a show. They waded through the downpour. Nobody budged. Finally, after an hour or so, it cleared enough. And, well, I better get out there and get to work before they mildew over. Where are we? Diego Garcia, huh? That's a little embarrassing because we started out for Honolulu. But we're awfully glad they slid the island under us when we dropped in, I want to tell you that. I'd like to thank you for inviting us here and the Flies for giving us permission to land. Our Seabees here share this base with the English. They coexist beautifully in spite of the language barrier.
Welcome to the world of 1972. The deportations, by the time Mr. Hope arrived, had been pretty much completed, and the entire population of the Chagos archipelago removed. 2,000 individuals deported to Mauritius and Seychelles. Some eventually made their way to Crawley, near Gatwick Airport. For several years, nothing much happened. And then in 1982, at the United Nations, a different Prime Minister of Mauritius called publicly for the first time for the return of the Chagos archipelago, which had been illegally detached. The Chagosians, too, themselves began to agitate, bringing cases before the English courts in London, and with some success. In 1998, Olivier Bancoult, Liseby Elysé's nephew, won a ruling from the Court of Appeal that the deportations were completely illegal. And Foreign Secretary Robin Cook agreed that they should all be able to return to the outer islands at least. And then came September the 11th. The US base at Diego Garcia was used as part of the Bush administration's program on extraordinary rendition and the embrace of torture. And in March 2003, the bombing of Baghdad actually began with planes that flew from Diego Garcia. And so a year later, the British government reversed its decision to allow Madame Elysé and all the other Chagosians to return to Peros Banhas and the outer islands, causing protests in Port Louis, the capital of Mauritius. The British High Commissioner was greeted by Chagosians who for the first time held placards that proclaimed Britain to be perpetrating a crime against humanity, and it was. And this was more or less how matters remained until 2010, when another Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, announced that Britain would establish a vast marine protected area over the whole of the Chagos archipelago, 640,000 square kilometres. The MPA would protect oceans and biodiversity and burnish Britain's green credentials, and it would cast a more favourable light on Chagos following news reports that Diego Garcia had been used for the war in Iraq and for extraordinary rendition in the war on terror, so-called. In that MPA, all fishing activity would be banned and all human activity would be banned, except around the military base and for wealthy owners of private yachts. The world's coverage of protected oceans would be doubled. The UK takes its international environmental responsibilities seriously, Mr. Miliband declared. And conservation groups were totally delighted, it must be said. The Zoological Society of London and the Chagos Conservation Trust, for example, declared the announcement to be historic, a true victory for global ocean conservation. But they were totally silent about the consequences for the Chagosians, who were deeply disturbed by the announcement about the use of their homelands. The government of Mauritius too was equally concerned because Prime Minister Gordon Brown had offered a private assurance that Britain would not act unilaterally. And then, as Port Louis pondered its options, a first miracle occurred. WikiLeaks unloaded millions of pages of top-secret United States diplomatic cables. One was a cable from the US Embassy in London to Washington, D.C., to the State Department. Mr. Colin Roberts, I think he must be named, Director of Overseas Territories at the Foreign Office, extolled the virtues of Mr. Miliband's plan to create what he called the largest marine reserve in the whole world, one that would prohibit all human activity, except, of course, on and around the US base at Diego Garcia, ! The proposal will create no difficulties for the local population, Mr. Roberts explained in the cable, because there are no inhabitants! And he went on. When you're in a hole, stop digging. We do not regret the removal of the population, the cable reported him to state. We do not regret that there will be no human footprints and no man Fridays on the uninhabited islands of Chagos. This is 2009. Okay, this is not Victorian era stuff. Marvellous, in other words. Environmental protection harnessed to stop the Chagosians from ever returning. That was really what was going on. This was a document of the kind to stiffen the backbone. The Chagosians lodged another case at the High Court in London to challenge the MPA on the grounds that its true purpose was to prevent them from returning. The case would be rejected, like others, by the Supreme Court, but not before it threw up, in the process of legal discovery, a raft of government documents that shone a truly terrible light on Britain's secret actions taken between 1963 and 1973. By now, in fact, the accounting firm KPMG was reporting that a return by the Chagosians was actually feasible. Artisanal fishing, small coconut plots, and ecotourism could provide jobs, and it would have no adverse environmental effects. But the British government decided against resettlement for reasons of feasibility, defence, and national security interests. Mr. Miliband's announcement, coupled with the WikiLeaks documents, prompted Mauritius to reach out to the lawyers, and I was contacted by the Prime Minister of Mauritius to lead a legal team to challenge Britain's actions under international law. Our options, it has to be said, were pretty limited, because the Foreign Office had closed off the possibility of Mauritius suing Britain directly at the International Court of Justice in a contentious bilateral dispute. And so the path that was chosen was arbitration under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, to obtain a ruling that the marine protected area was illegal for two reasons. First, because Mauritius was not consulted on the impact on its own fishing and other rights, and second, because Mauritius, not the United Kingdom, was the coastal state, and only it had the right to declare a marine protected area around its own territory, because Chagos was illegally detached in 1965. Now, it has to be said, the path of justice is not a speedy one. There were 3 years of pleadings, then a hearing in Istanbul at the famous Pera Palace Hotel, where Agatha Christie wrote Murder on the Orient Express, and then in March 2015, finally, a judgment. The 5 arbitrators ruled unanimously that the MPA was totally unlawful, because Mauritius had not been consulted. But, on the other hand, a narrow majority, 3 judges to 2, ruled that the tribunal could not exercise jurisdiction to decide which of the 2 countries, Mauritius or Britain, was the coastal state, or on the legal effects of Resolution 1514 and the principle of territorial integrity, because, they ruled, that was a matter of sovereignty over land and could not be governed by a tribunal applying the Convention on the Law of the Sea. However, 2 arbitrators dissented, opining that the tribunal could and should have ruled that Mauritius was the coastal state and that it had never consented to the detachment. And, they added, Harold Wilson's frighten them with hope strategy amounted to an act of duress, so that, they concluded, Britain's last colony was illegal and without effect. I've learnt in life that often when you're doing cases, for the long terms, it's the dissents that really matter. And the 2 dissenters, Judge Kateka of Tanzania and Judge Wolfram of Germany, had in fact opened a big door. The government of Mauritius asked again, is there a route to the International Court of Justice and The Hague, the UN's principal judicial organ, the place known as the World Court? There was one route. The International Court of Justice can give something called an advisory opinion to the United Nations General Assembly on matters within the General Assembly's competence. In 2010, we had advised against that option, as we thought it unlikely that Mauritius would be able to persuade a majority of the members of the United Nations to vote against the power bloc that was two permanent members of the Security Council, the UK and the US. But now there was a change of circumstance. Two of the judges had found in favour of Mauritius. And then a second moment of magic descended from the skies in June 2016. You all know what happened. Britain voted to leave the European Union. What you know less well is the effect that had on Britain's international reputation and authority. I was there. It's totally what happened. As various ministers who shall remain nameless waxed lyrically about a new Empire 2.0 and alliances with Commonwealth countries, Britain's authority suffered an instant and total collapse. All the members of the European Union whose lobbying could normally be relied upon said, "Not our problem anymore, you are on your own." And so the subject of Chagos unbelievably made it onto the agenda of the United Nations General Assembly. Bereft of European Union help, in June 2017, the General Assembly debated a draft resolution to request an ICJ advisory opinion, the first time in the history of the United Nations that all African countries voted together. I travelled to New York in that period to lobby as part of the Mauritian team. Britain and the United States warned that the UN and the court were being used inappropriately. Backdoor routes must never be allowed, they said. And I spent hours and hours seated at a small table in a place called the Indonesia Lounge at UN headquarters, spending 10 minutes, one after the other, with about 42 different delegates from many countries. Some of them were my former students. Over the entire long day, meeting with 42 countries takes hours and hours and hours, only two delegates, a very genial Australian and a rather sensitive Canadian, expressed any support at all for the United Kingdom, and they did so with very little enthusiasm. Many more delegates evoked Britain's continuing colonial instinct, patronising, entitled, hubristic. And I learned a great deal that day. The huge gap that exists between how Britain sees itself in the world and how the rest of the world sees Britain. At this point, a third miracle arrived, which we could not have predicted. A new British Foreign Secretary was appointed. A gentleman who wrote articles in the Daily Telegraph, read by literally every delegate at the United Nations. Articles that spoke about piccaninnies with watermelon smiles. Now, that may work with readers of the Daily Telegraph. It does not work at the United Nations. With the vote, the voting board of the General Assembly lit up. Green in favour, red against, yellow for abstentions, and black for a country that was absent. Resolution 71292 passed with a very large majority. 94 countries in favour, 16 against, and 65 abstentions, including, very significantly, China, Russia, and France. Only Croatia and Hungary of the European Union supported Britain, along with just 3 of the 54 members of the Commonwealth. Not one country from Africa or the Caribbean supported Britain. The single Latin American country to support the United Kingdom was Chile, which happens to be the subject of my next book, as I mentioned. A story of two men, Augusto Pinochet and the time he spent in London, and a former SS officer called Walter Rauff, who was a friend of Mr. Pinochet's, who embarked and fled along the Rat Line to a remarkable city written about by the wonderful Bruce Chatwin in his book In Patagonia, the town of Punta Arenas, a place I have come to know well.
So this poem is called Laguna Grande by the Chilean poet Mariana Camelio. The peat bog is a type of wetland of a ruddy grey mud that seems like clay. The water does not flow here. It feels like moss. One day we found king crab skeletons. From the main house we saw red spots on the peat. Inside the legs remained that flexible and transparent cartilage. The outer body instead was rigid. I feel sorry for how they creak, you told me. We unclasp reddish shells. The ground sank up to our legs. It was 9 a.m. The grandmother I don't know dipped her fingers in that white meat, thinks of the only sea trench she remembers, and envisions maps with fjords like crustacean legs.
Chile did not manage to stop the General Assembly sending 2 questions to the International Court of Justice. The first was, has decolonization of Mauritius been lawfully completed, given the detachment of Chagos? And the second, what are the consequences if the court rules that the detachment was illegal? In September 2018, the case was heard at the court. The first person to address the court was Sir Anirudh Jugnauth, the last living survivor of the Lancaster House Conference with Harold Wilson in 1965. And on the first morning of the hearings, the judges watched the very same video that you have watched of Madame Elysé. She was there in court, sitting in the front row, and it was indeed a remarkable thing to watch the judges watching her. Britain argued before the court that the court should decline to exercise its jurisdiction, but if it did exercise its jurisdiction, the detachment was, in any event, perfectly lawful under international law. What about the Chagosians? Well, said the UK Solicitor General, the manner of their removal surely was shameful and wrong, but not the fact that it occurred. Madame Elisé's words, he said, were indeed very moving, and he expressed deep respect to the Chagosians, but added nothing else. There was no commitment given to right the wrong. There was no concession on any right of return. A bit of compensation was paid, and that was amends enough in the view of the United Kingdom. 23 countries addressed the court over that week. The UK and the US were supported by just 2 countries, Australia and Israel, but the rest of the world, every continent, supported Mauritius. South Africa spoke with a particular authority. Since 5 decades earlier, it had taken a similar position to that now being articulated by Britain in respect of its illegal occupation of a place that was then known as Southwest Africa, today Namibia. As a former colony, Counsel for South Africa said, "We know all about this kind of colonialism and deportations and their continuing effects. We know what it means when entire communities are taken from their homes on the basis of race. There is," she said to the judges, "no such thing as part freedom. Decolonization can never be partial." The words were lifted from Nelson Mandela, whose bust happened to stand on a pedestal right outside the Great Hall of Justice in The Hague. The court delivered its verdict in February 2019. Yes, it had jurisdiction, and no, there was no reason not to exercise that jurisdiction. It had all the facts it needed before it. The questions sent by the General Assembly were within its competence. It was about decolonisation, not a bilateral dispute, as Britain had argued. On the merits, the facts were clear, the court decided. The British and Americans discussed matters. An agreement was reached and Chagos was detached. Independence followed. The Chagosians were forcibly removed. Those are strong words from the court. Was decolonisation completed? No, it was not. Resolution 1514 reflected international law in 1965, and it prohibited the disruption of the territorial integrity of a country without its consent. Did Mauritius consent? That was the crucial question. It did not. Paragraph 172 of the court's opinion is crucial. Having reviewed the circumstances in which the Council of Ministers of the Colony of Mauritius agreed in principle to the detachment of the Chagos archipelago on the basis of the Lancaster House Agreement, the court considers that this detachment was not based on the free and genuine expression of the will of the people concerned. And many, of course, who have an interest in Ireland will take a very close look at what the court said. And they might draw inspiration as to another and more Irish circumstance in which the free and genuine expression of the will of the people back in 1922 was or was not obtained. The detachment of Chagos, in any event, was not based on the free and genuine expression of the will, and that was all of the people of Mauritius. And so it followed that the detachment was unlawful, that a new colony had been created illegally, and that the decolonisation of Mauritius was incomplete. Turning to the second question, the court looked at the consequences. Since Britain's occupation of Chagos was illegal and the continued administration was a wrongful act, the court concluded Britain must end its administration as rapidly as possible. Chagos, they said, is part of Mauritius, not the United Kingdom. The court passed the baton to the General Assembly, including on the future of the Chagosians. Only one judge dissented, the American judge, but she did so only on grounds that the court did not have jurisdiction. She didn't say anything on the merits and offered no support to the United Kingdom. 3 months later, in May 2019, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 73295, which welcomed the court's opinion, affirmed Chagos to be an integral part of Mauritius, and ordered Britain to leave by November 2019. And the UN body ruled the Chagosians must be able to resettle as a matter of urgency. The UN, the UN's members, the specialised agencies, and every international organisation in the world must recognise Chagos as part of Mauritius, and they must ignore forthwith any measures purportedly taken on the place known as the British Indian Ocean Territory, in quotation marks. This resolution got an even bigger majority. Support now rose to 116 countries, and only 4 countries in the world voted with Britain and the United States: Israel, the Maldives, Australia, and Hungary. Embarrassing, the New York Times reported. And it fell to the British ambassador to offer a last word. She appeared depleted, crumpled, apparently tearful, and she sort of dissembled. Britain remained firmly committed to self-determination, she declared, just not for Mauritius. What she did instead, remarkably, was to evoke the Falkland Islands. No sovereignty until those islanders so wished, she told the Assembly. It was an immensely awkward moment, because many in the room heard her, in effect, to be evoking one rule for the whites and another for the blacks. So what came next? The court's advisory opinion and the General Assembly resolution came in the dying days of Theresa May's government, landing in the inbox of then Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt. Whitehall insiders offered two options. The realists said that Britain, the US and Mauritius should sit down and sort the matter out on the basis of the advisory opinion. The government may not like that opinion, but it was what it was. Britain would have to live with it, and in any event, Mauritius had long committed to the continuation of the US base at Diego Garcia. But there was another view, the fundamentalists, pushed by the country's national security advisor at the time, who believed that Chagos was so indispensable to national security that Britain should simply ignore the ruling completely, hunker down and carry on as though nothing had happened. And it was that view which prevailed. The British government rejected outright the ruling of the court, saying it wasn't binding on the United Kingdom as such, and the Chagosians would never be allowed to return. They remained exiles in their own land.
This poem is called In Our Own Country by Eavan Boland. They are making a new Ireland at the end of our road, under our very eyes. Under the arc lamps they aim and beam into distances where we once lived, into vistas we will never recognize. We are here to watch. We are looking for new knowledge. They have been working here in all weathers, tearing away the road to our village, bridge, path, river, all lost under an onslaught of steel. An old Europe has come to us as a stranger in our city, has forgotten its own music, wars and treaties, is now a machine from the Netherlands or Belgium, dragging, tossing, breaking apart the clay in which our timid spring used to arrive with our daffodils in a single, crooked row. Remember the emigrant boat? Remember the lost faces burned in the last glances? The air clearing away to nothing, nothing, nothing. We pull our collars tightly around our necks, but the wind finds our throats predatory and wintry. We walk home. What we know is this, and this is all we know. We are now, and we will always be from now on. And for all I know, we have always been exiles in our own country.
Since December 2019, then, Britain has been an illegal occupier of a part of the territory of Mauritius and Africa. It is exactly the same as South Africa being an illegal occupier of Namibia in the period from 1971 to 1994. And so we ask, was that the end of the matter? No, it was not. The advisory opinion had very significant legal effects for the United Nations and for all of its specialized agencies. The UN immediately changed its map of the world, which, if you go on the website, shows Chagos as part of Mauritius. The Food and Agriculture Organization, for example, decided no longer to recognize Britain's claim to be able to fish in the waters around the coast of the Chagos archipelago. And the Universal Postal Union in Geneva notified Britain that henceforth it would no longer distribute any letter that bore a postage stamp issued by the territory formerly known as the British Indian Ocean Territory. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in Hamburg ruled that the advisory opinion was, to all intents and purposes, binding on it, that Chagos was part of Mauritius, and that the maritime boundary between Chagos and its nearest neighbour, the Maldives, would now be delimited by the tribunal with Mauritius. Britain was out of the picture. What was Britain's reaction? Well, like so much these days, it just sort of buried its head in the sand and hoped that the whole problem would somehow just go away. After the Itlos judgment from Hamburg, a minister at the Ministry of Defence just declared in Parliament the same old mantra, we have no doubt about our sovereignty, blah, 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 and even suggested that Britain would draw its own maritime boundary with the Maldives. This is completely delusional Britain. 28 international judges and arbitrators have expressed views on the Chagos archipelago. Not a single one, not even the British, has expressed support for Britain's colonial claim. Curiouser and curiouser, it might be said, of Britain's current disposition. It's a sort of Britain in wonderland, hopeless. And across the world, there is incredulity and sadness. What happened to the country that believed in the rule of law? I'm often asked on my travels around the world. What happened to respect for international institutions? To be sure, the position on Chagos is part of a much bigger picture, one in which the government treats judges and lawyers with contempt, sees international law as a nuisance and an inconvenience, and believes that international agreements, like, for example, the Northern Ireland Protocol to the Brexit withdrawal agreement, can just be torn up at will. A big, big price is being paid for this. Trust and credibility and authority, as I said, are shot to pieces. The world is a small place. Beijing and Moscow laugh, Europe weeps, and many around the world just feel an acute sense of embarrassment when the subject of Britain comes up. In the US too, there are difficulties. President Biden has called the rule of law one of America's most cherished democratic values, a riposte to the years of the Trump administration, and a very useful stick with which to beat China in relation to its lawlessness in the South China Seas and Russia in relation to its lawlessness on Ukraine. Secretary of State Antony Blinken castigates Beijing for making unlawful maritime claims in the South China Seas and for ignoring law of the sea rulings, a case I know well as I was counsel for the Philippines in a judgment which found against China. But the Biden-Blinken position of principle is totally undermined by its support for Britain on Chagos. One act of lawlessness does not justify another. If you want to weaponize the rule of law, you've at least got to be sure that your own house is in order. A civilization that plays fast and loose with its principles is a dying civilization. The philosopher Aimé Césaire wrote in his extraordinary book, Discourse on Colonialism. The government isn't entirely alone in its little state of wonderland. Private businesses too turn a blind eye. A company called Shaw, Guernsey-based, Bahraini-owned telecoms, offers telephone, broadband and other services to those who live on Biot today and to nearby mariners. This is manifestly illegal under international law and the law of Mauritius. If you're a football supporter, and in the city of Liverpool I am sure there are many football supporters, indeed one of my most recent visits to Liverpool was in the company of my friend of more than 40 years, the great footballer Charlie George. My dad was his dentist, who scored, I will remind you, the winning goal in the 1971 FA Cup final against Liverpool. But last time I saw Arsenal play Liverpool at Anfield, we lost 5-1, and Charlie left at half-time. He retreated to the pub with my brother, in disgust. Anyway, back to the lecture. Football supporters will recognise the hoardings around the stadium and on our television screens for companies like sportsbet.io, a betting company. Have you ever asked yourself what .io stands for? It stands for Indian Ocean, and it is a domain name that is assigned to and by the British Indian Ocean Territory. It's incredibly popular with tech companies. It is one of the costliest domain names you can get, and someone out there is making tens of millions of pounds a year out of an act of manifest illegality. The tiny Pobjoy Mint, on the other hand, in Surrey, still sells Biot coins. And I wondered whether Her Majesty was aware that her image, along with the Chagos anemone, known as the clownfish, was being used with such lawless abandon. The question, I suppose, is, will King Charles III allow his image ever to be used on a Biot coin? The Zoological Society of London, famous, renowned, patron, Her Majesty the Queen, although I suppose that will soon be His Majesty the King, is immensely proud of its marine conservation work on Chagos, but it totally ignores the international rulings. It issues reports, hopes to send out scientific expeditions, and this has just changed, until recently had a website that proclaimed Chagos to be part of Britain. The Foreign Office actually retains the services of another company, MRAG, a maritime company, to provide scientific and technical advice on the management of the waters of the Chagos archipelago and the wholly illegal marine protected area. It provides one vessel, one boat, to patrol the 640,000 square kilometres of maritime space. And on the basis of a Freedom of Information request, it emerged that the principal source of pollution in the Chagos archipelago was this boat. Even better, the executive chair, founder, and owner of MRAG, almost unbelievably, was until recently and oh so cosily the president of the Zoological Society of London and a former chief scientist to the British government. It seems that lawlessness is a cosy thing and it is safer in numbers. Now, let me be clear, that conservation work, I believe, is hugely important and deserves the fullest support. I've taught international environmental law since 1989. If it is being done lawfully, with the support of Mauritius, it should be fully supported. But it's not. Britain's illegal occupation of Chagos, with support from companies like Shaw and sportsbet.io and very reputable organisations like the Zoological Society of London, are the actions which are stopping Liseby Elysé and the other Chagosians from going back to their homes from which they were forcibly removed. All of these organisations have in effect been instrumentalised and weaponised. They are being used by the British government to maintain an illegal occupation and to allow the environment to be used to trump the rights of people like Liseby Elysé. And perhaps those engaged in authorising or engaging in these activities may start to want to reflect on their association with illegality on such a rampant scale, and on the human consequences of their actions. Let's not forget that international law treats forcible deportation without lawful cause as an international crime. I described that in East-West Street. When Hirsch Lauterpacht put the concept of crimes against humanity into the Nuremberg Statute and international law in its Article 6, paragraph C, he and Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor, included in terms deportation. They called it the forcible transfer of a group from one territory to another, and they said that is a crime against humanity always. The 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights recognises the right that each of us have to return to our country. The 1949 Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibit the forcible transfer of individuals or groups. And Article 7 of the Statute of the International Criminal Court adopted in 1998, defines a crime against humanity as including the deportation or forcible transfer of populations. One leading council has already prepared a decent opinion which concludes that it is strongly arguable that the forcible removal of the entire population of Chagos was an international crime. I think and understand that early in the new year, Human Rights Watch will publish a report on the plight of the Chagosians, and they will describe it, I believe, as a crime against humanity. What is to be done? Seamus Heaney, in his remarkable lecture in 1995 on being honoured with the Nobel Prize for Literature, said and spoke of the quicksand of relativism. There is no relativism in this story to justify. There is a reasonable and clear solution, one that respects the intertwined issues, the territorial integrity of Mauritius, the rights of the Chagosians, the protection of the environment, and matters of national security through the continuation of the base. Mauritius, Britain, and the US have close and excellent relations, and India can and will likely play a significant role. Mauritius's sovereignty is now clear under international law. Mauritius supports the continuation of the base at Diego Garcia. Mauritius has declared the creation of a lawful marine conservation area for the whole of Chagos and made clear that it would like to work with the British government, scientists, conservationists, and organisations like the Zoological Society of London, which leaves, of course, the Chagosians, who are the beating heart of this terrible story. They are a large group. I first met some of them more than a decade ago at a meeting at the Royal Geographic Society in London. A huge number of individuals with many views and many aspirations. Some want to return to the outer islands of Chagos, including Peros Banhos, or to work at the US base alongside other nationals working there today as part of Mauritius. The outer islands sustained human habitation for more than 2 centuries, and they can do so again now. They are far from Diego Garcia. They pose no security threat whatsoever. Writing for the majority in one of the Bancu cases before the Supreme Court in London, Lord Hoffman, one of the justices, made clear that allowing the Chagosians to return would create no threat of terrorism or difficulties for national security. The contrary view was, in his words, fanciful speculation. And so there is an easy win-win-win outcome. Security, human rights, the marine environment, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity can all be assured. This is not a zero-sum game. And that's why I wrote The Last Colony, to hold in a simple thought that reality and justice can stand together, to ensure that any Chagosian who wants to can return to Chagos and Mauritius, and to encourage Britain to lower its flag on its last colony in Africa. The alternative will simply continue to undermine the authority of this country. And now, finally, after so many years, after an interminable struggle, there are signs that change is in the air. In February, in the context of the case to delimit the maritime boundary between Mauritius and Maldives, of which I spoke, in Hamburg, Mauritius organised a site visit to the Chagos archipelago. We gathered a few months ago at the dock of the port in the town of Mahe in the Seychelles on the Indian Ocean. We were 25, Mauritian government officials, marine scientists, journalists, lawyers, academics, and of course, Liseby Elysé, and 4 others from Chagos. Her nephew, Olivier, Marcel, her childhood friend from Ile-du-Coin, Rosamund, who spent her first 17 years on Salomon, and Suzelle, who was forcibly removed from Diego Garcia at the age of 11 months because she was a contract labourer. We sailed on the Bleu de Nîmes, a journey of 1,000 miles. This was the first visit ever by Mauritius to this part of its own territory. It was the first time any Chagosian returned without an armed British escort or any British escort. It was the first time that any journalists ever visited this part of the Chagos archipelago, and of course it was my first time there. After 5 days at sea, the boat approached Perros Banhos, and we were able to see the place where Liseby Elysé was born, the sandy fringe, the palm trees of little Ile du Coin, the reefs, the waves, the birds. The anchor was lowered, and Liseby pointed for all of us to the house where she was born. She had a large smile, and her eyes were dancing.
Ta grâce, nous te remercie, qui nous réussit tous nous la terre, quand nous sommes nés. Surtout pour Olivier, Marcel et Judith, qui sont nés là, aujourd'hui nous recevons tout ça. Nous rendons ta grâce, nous te remercie, et nous avons envie de prier aussi. Et tout le monde du monde qui est là, qui nous accompagne, qui peut mettre dans nos chemins, nous jeter un grand merci.
As you saw, Liseby was the first on the island, bending to touch the water and the fine white sand, and her nephew Olivier sank to the knees. The 5 Chagosians stood together in prayer. They're a very religious community. They held hands, and frankly, all the rest of us cried as we saw them arrive. And the first thing they did, it was incredibly powerful, was to start cleaning up. They went first to the church, and they cleaned out the church. And then they went to the cemetery, and they cleaned out the graves. On the beach, Liseby perched on a long, thin, sturdy trunk of an old palm that had fallen across the land and hung over the blue water. She bounced up and down, and she laughed. Like when I was a child, she remembered. She danced to the rhythm of her favourite songs, Perros Vert and Grand-Maman Chagosien, in harmony with Olivier, Marcel, Suzelle and Rosamond. And then later, as we headed back, sitting on the deck of the boat, I watched she and Marcel reminisce about childhood, about playing hide and seek between the palms. Marcel was just the same back then as he is today, she told me. Busy, busy, busy. And Liseby, I asked her friend Marcel, the fisherman. He offered one of his magical, mellow grins, one that infused his entire face. She was the same as she always has been. Round, round, round. He laughed, stood, puffed out his body, stooped and sort of waddle bounced away, and we all roared with laughter. He went over to Liseby and put his fingers on her forehead. It was as though an entire lifetime of affection was reflected in that single moment of touch. And then 6 months later, 3 weeks ago, something finally cracked. In November, just a few days ago, in a written answer in Parliament, the British Foreign Secretary announced a 180-degree change of position. Britain would now start to negotiate with Mauritius on the exercise of sovereignty on the basis of international law. And believe it or not, miracles never end. In the 6 weeks of her premiership, this was due to a decision taken by Liz Truss. Yep. And so, incredibly, thank you, Liz Truss. It seems that the moment of truth-telling, as Seamus Heaney put it, that is hard and retributive, but which will not harden the mind to a point where it denies its sense of caring for timeliness and trust. Things are about to change. It seems that next year the flag will come down on Britain's last colony in Africa. It will mark the end of an age and the beginning of a new moment, one, we might hope, that could allow us to look back with a greater degree of honesty and to look forward with a greater degree of hope and decency.
This is the closing chorus from The Cure at Troy by Seamus Heaney. Now it's high watermark and flood tide in the heart and time to go. The sea nymphs in the spray will be the chorus now. What's left to say? Suspect too much sweet talk, but never close your mind. It was a fortunate wind that blew me here. I leave, half ready to believe that a crippled trust might walk, and the half-true rhyme is love.
Here. I am conscious that we began late and are running late, so I'm going to make this a brief Q&A, and then we'll have time for a glass of wine in the lobby, where if you want to buy some of Philippe's work or some of Seamus's work or just chat, that will be possible. So I'll just take a few questions. If anyone would like to lead out, there's a question. We have a mic coming to you right here in the middle there, Jerry.
I just wondered when the lease runs out on Diego Garcia.
The lease runs out in 2036, but negotiations are now underway, and the hope and expectation of both sides is that the matter can be finally resolved by the middle of next year. So I think you can watch this space.
Question here, Jerry, in the front row.
Thanks, Jerry. I was fascinated by that part of the International Court's judgment, which effectively looked at what happened at Lancaster House as bullying. And what are the limitations of that doctrine? Because it could unravel all sorts of, poor agreements, couldn't it? The Anglo-Irish agreement being one of them.
You will have noticed my choice of words was very, very careful. I don't want to be accused of a great unravelling. I'm very respectful of my many friends in Ireland who have very strong views on certain issues in several different directions. But I can tell you that a lot of people around the world, including in Dublin, are paying a great deal of attention to that passage. I'm not well versed enough in other historical matters to express any view, but I did take a quick look, I must say, at 1922 to inform myself a little bit better, and I defer here in particular to the Heaney family and the great Seamus Heaney on matters of that aspect. Incidentally, Justine and I had the happiness of travelling together on the train from London, and we both read, and I really do encourage you to read it, one of the truly great lectures I've ever read, the 1995 Nobel lecture. It's extraordinary, and we were commenting on the train as we entered Lime Street that was there a touch of criticism from Mr. Heaney towards Mr. Yeats in relation to the amount of time he may have spent addressing certain matters? I see various people nodding around the room. I've learnt to exercise great caution in addressing matters relating to any aspect of Ireland, and not to tread in with my own half-formed views and ideas. And that dates to the single most embarrassing experience of my professional career. When I was a young barrister and I worked on unbelievably, someone claimed to have found gold in a part of Northern Ireland about 25 or 30 years ago. And there was a planning inquiry, and I was instructed by the opponents of the idea of excavating what was said to be a sacred mountain to mine gold. And what I'm about to say does not show me in any decent light at all. But my opening words to the planning inspector were to express my great pleasure in being in the Republic of Northern Ireland. As a young barrister, you're often very anxious, and there was a sort of stunned silence in the room, and the planning inspector said, "Well, Mr. Sands, perhaps you know something we don't."
I'll take one last question. It's just up behind you there, Jerry, on the edge. Yeah, man in the blue top.
Forgive me if I've got this wrong, but I believe today is the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the Free State. Yeah, so happy birthday.
It's today.
But the question or the comment was, I was fascinated when you said about how Britain sees itself in the world and how the world sees Britain, and particularly relating to the Brexit debate, shall we say, the use of the word Great Britain, which is actually a geographical term, but was used more as a kind of, we are great. I wonder how much that has sort of influenced the way Britain sees itself and has seen it, and is seen, perhaps.
I mean, I could give you another lecture if you want to know. I won't.
Please do.
What I will say is this, just very briefly. I mean, it was a very complex emotion sitting in the Indonesia lounge, because on the one hand, I have my duties to my client, which is the government of Mauritius, to get a good result, which is as many people as possible to vote, to send these questions to the International Court of Justice and persuade as many delegates, to basically vote against the United Kingdom. On the other hand, I do believe that in my world of international law, the United Kingdom, warts and all, it's not a perfect record, we know that, has generally been a pretty good force. And it really saddens me to see what has happened. And I really hope, and I'm not making a party political point, because I think it could be across the political spectrum, that we could begin to have some sort of a change. But we've really got to recognise that we are, in terms of our global reputation, in terrible, terrible trouble. And that, I think, people are beginning to understand the extent of it. In relation to your question on the great, it's been really interesting for me writing this book and being immersed in this issue for the last 12 years against the background of having written East-West Street and The Rat Line. I've spent a lot of time in Germany. I do a lot of book talks in Germany, and one of the things that I've come to recognize, even actually without writing these books, is that young German people, my German students, still feel this incredible burden of history, almost a sense of embarrassment for what happened between 1933 and 1945. And I often find myself in my own classrooms at UCL suggesting to a young German student who doesn't want to own up in class to being German because they feel such a sense of shame. By contrast, the reality is, and we know this if we're honest, the United Kingdom has not looked with an honest gaze at aspects of its past. And I think that's really the reason we have got to the point that we have. We've deflected our attention from certain realities. I mean, it's not that I want to paint Britain in a sort of dark light or as a terrible country. I don't think it is, any more than any other. But we haven't engaged with colonialism at all. We haven't engaged with slavery at all. Where is the literature about those issues? Where are the English poets who write about those issues? There aren't any. There aren't any. Literally none. And until very recently, until the last few years. In writing The Last Colony, I had to ask myself the question, how could it be I, who was so attuned to international matters, had just missed this whole Chagos story? When the Prime Minister of Mauritius called me in April 2010, the same week, incidentally, in which I got the invitation to go to Lviv to write what became East-West Street, I hadn't even heard of Chagos. I didn't know what Chagos was. I'd heard of Diego Garcia, as many of you have, but I didn't know what Chagos was. How can it be that I knew nothing about the fact that in my lifetime, Britain had deported so many people and refused to allow them to go back? So I went back to my school history book when I was 12 in 1972, and we studied aspects of this. I mean, it isn't on the curriculum. Even my own kids tell me they've never really learned about British colonialism and contribute. They said we learn about how Britain ended the slave trade, but we hear nothing. And incidentally, big commendations to Liverpool. I'm going tomorrow morning to the only museum of slavery in any city in the United Kingdom. That's a really major thing that is being done in this remarkable city. But I found my history book. Some of you may have had the same history book. Geoffrey Treece, This Is Your Century. So I had not opened Geoffrey Treece, This Is Your Century, for about 40 years. But I found it in the attic, and it was a real shocker. I think it's chapter 8. I write about it. I quote it in the book. Because the book is a very personal account. It's not a law book. And I wanted readers to understand how I address these issues. Chapter 8, Sunset on Empire, begins with a conversation, lines about India, and a comparison between the fantastic bloke who used to run that place, Viscount Mountbatten. Tall, gorgeous, wonderful. And the bloke who took over, short, pacifist, vegetarian, in a loincloth. And then, unbelievably, I kid you not, a bit like a monkey in glasses. So is it any surprise that people from my generation were sort of encouraged to think in a certain way, and it took us decades to free the shackles of what had been infused in us on the greatness of Britain? Britain's done many great things and continues to do many great things, and for the young people in the audience will continue to do some great things. But there are aspects that are not so great, and I think we should be a bit more honest about those aspects.
Thank you, Philippe. Just before we go and have a glass of wine, and I give a final thanks to tonight's speakers, there's one more small but important matter. When we inaugurated the Seamus Heaney lecture, at the same time, in order to honour Seamus Heaney's name, we also inaugurated a prize for the best essay by an undergraduate in the field of Irish literature. And the winner of this year's prize is with us tonight. He's Nate Reid, and he wins the prize for an essay which is uncannily called, given tonight's lecture, "History is a Nightmare from Which I Am Trying to Awake." Joyce's philosophy of history and time in Ulysses. The essay is a model of close reading of the novel, which, of course, celebrates its centenary this year, like the Irish Free State. It's combined with an application of the philosophies of Vico, Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Immanuel Kant, and it was a marvelous essay to read, and it's what university is all about and what universities are for. And it's wonderful to see work being done of that quality being done by undergraduates. So I'd invite Nate to join me here, and Catherine Heaney, just to congratulate Nate, please. Thank you.
Nate, just on behalf of my family, I'd like to congratulate you. Dad was a writer, but he was also a teacher his whole life, and so it means a lot to us that tonight also honours academic achievement and engagement with literature, so congratulations to you. And again, on behalf of my family, just to extend our thanks to Philippe for that extraordinary lecture, to Justine for the beautiful readings, to our friends at the Institute for their commitment to this lecture, and to all of you for coming. So thank you very much.
I think I just hope that there was someone from the Liverpool Echo here tonight to get the Liz Truss scoop. I think it's time for a glass of wine.